Malik. I am the Executive Director of the Internet Society's New York chapter, where among many things, I am tasked with leading our digital preservation campaign. For those of you who do not know about the Internet Society, or ISOC for short, we're a nonprofit organization founded in 1992 to provide leadership in internet-related standards, education, access, and policy. Our mission is to promote the open development, evolution, and use of the internet for the benefit of all people throughout the world. Helping to preserve our digital bits is a natural fit for ISOC in order to ensure that the information we create now will be accessible for future generations, and that the internet continues to be a beneficial tool for our global society. I see our focus, especially here in New York City, to be at the intersection of technology, business, and civic engagement. Because of that, our chapter is perfectly positioned to launch the digital preservation campaign with the following goals: to bring awareness to the multi-layered issues surrounding preserving our digital data, to educate users on the importance of digital preservation, and to engage the community, both local and global, to help come up with feasible solutions. This is the second in a series of events that we've been planning, the first of which was last month in Washington, D.C., focused more around policy issues, and we had an incredibly lively and engaging discussion. It was a lot of fun. I have no doubt we'll have even more fun tonight. We'd like to have a few more events throughout 2018 addressing other themes such as technological challenges and solutions, and even art and society. This is not a new topic by any means, and there's already a lot of hard work being done in this field. If you're interested in partnering with us or joining our campaign in order to help raise awareness and bridge the knowledge gap, please visit digitalpreservationnow.com, and definitely feel free to speak to me after the event. We're very proud to have Google join as a member, and we certainly need more organizations to join and help. On that note, I'd really like to thank Google for hosting us here today. They're a wonderful organization, especially Denise Kelly and Carla Lefevre for all of your help. Thank you, Vint, for making yourself available, as always, and for speaking. A special thanks to Richard Witt, who's not in the room right now, I don't think, for being a tremendous resource on digital preservation, as well as a great sounding board. He wrote an extremely informative white paper on the topic, which I highly recommend you all read. It's available for download on the digitalpreservationnow.com site. Our discussion tonight, as you all know, if you read the title of the event, is around business models and financial incentives, though I'm sure it will not be limited to that. Following Vint Cerf's presentation, we are very pleased to have two excellent respondents join us. For the sake of time and attention spans, I'm abbreviating bios and hopefully cause no disrespect in the process. Brad Burnham is a partner at Union Square Ventures, one of the top returning venture capital funds in the world. He started working in information technology with AT&T in 1979, and needless to say, has a lot of insight and knowledge in this area. We're also joined by Robert Cartolano, and he's the Associate Vice President for Technology and Preservation at Columbia University Libraries. He has over 30 years of academic IT experience and has a BS and MS in computer science from Columbia University School of Engineering and Applied Science. Throughout the evening, there will be a lot of opportunities for audience participation, so gather your thoughts and questions. If you're doing the social media thing, we're using the hashtag digital preservation. I was also informed, for those of you watching on the live stream, that the captioning, if you want to follow along with captions, you have to go to bit.ly/ISOCtext, and I believe the captions are overlaid on the monitors beside me, or so I was told. All right, so let's get started. It's a real honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Vint Cerf. We all know him as one of the fathers of the internet, and he is someone who is passionately concerned about the internet we're handing down to future generations, which is why it's no surprise that he cares so much about avoiding a looming digital dark age. He's not only one of the fathers of the internet, but also a founder of the Internet Society. So on so many levels, it's very fitting that we have him speak here today. So give it up for Vint Cerf, please. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us here at Google New York City. This is one of the largest of the Google operations in the United States, not counting, of course, our headquarters in Mountain View, soon to be renamed Googleville, I think. I want to acknowledge two people who are here tonight, Dave Farber, who's in the corner over here, and Paul Toomey, who's next to him. Dave is sometimes referred to as the grandfather of the internet because his work in networking goes all the way back into the early 1960s and even before that, but especially at University of California, Irvine with his local area network, where Paul Toomey was the CEO of ICANN for some period of time while I was chairman. and fought many policy battles that accompany the business of the internet today. And it won't be any surprise that the discussion today about digital preservation will incorporate some of those challenges as we try to wrestle with ways to preserve digital content. I've decided not to use slides or anything like that. I'd much rather have a conversation with you. I'm hoping that between me and the respondents, the rest of us in the room will have a chance to surface ideas and issues that might address some of the challenges that lie before us. From the technical point of view, we are faced with a vastly increasing amount of digitally generated content. So this isn't just about taking old non-digital content and digitizing it, which is going on to a great extent, and it has some benefits. The digitization of otherwise non-digital material makes it sometimes available to computers and processing for all kinds of analytical purposes, which we could not accomplish without having actually had that digital form. On the other hand, it places the information in a form whose longevity is in question. I don't think I have to emphasize this very much, but some of you may remember 8-inch floppy disks for the Wang word processor, or the 5¼ inch floppy disks that came along with some of the early IBM PCs and the Apple II and II Plus and so on, or the 3½ inch floppy disks that came along with subsequent personal computers, or CDs, CD-ROMs and DVDs and so on. And you will have noticed that while the media still persists, and some of you, like me, have them stacked up, gathering dust in various closets in our houses, the readers for these devices may no longer be available, or if they're physically available, they don't run because the computer that they were attached to isn't available anymore. I even tried something not too long ago. I found some 3½ inch floppy disks, and I was quite curious about what was on them. So I went out on eBay, and I bought a 3½ inch floppy disk reader with a USB on it that I could plug into a more recent Macintosh laptop. And indeed, incredibly, the files were readable. And they all turned out to be WordPerfect files, for which I did not have a WordPerfect processor. And I'm sure, every time I mention this, somebody jumps up and says, well, on the net, there's a thing that will translate from WordPerfect to Microsoft Document or something, which is probably true. On the other hand, I don't know that we can rely on this. And so my concern is that we not have a policy of digital preservation by accident. This is not a plan. I want capabilities that we can rely on. And the other people will say, well, not everything should be preserved. And even if I agreed with that, it's not always clear which things should be preserved and which things shouldn't. And what I want is for each of you, if you had something you really, really thought ought to be preserved for yourself, for your family, for generations to come, you should have access to a technology, an affordable and sustainable technology that would allow that item to be preserved, to be reproducible, to be displayable, to be interacted with, in the case of a piece of software that you actually work with, like a spreadsheet. So you should have access to that capability, even if not everything that people create is preserved ad infinitum. So I want you to think a little bit about this. First of all, we know that the media themselves may not survive forever. On the other hand, we can copy bits from one medium to another, and this happens all the time. At Google, for example, we have these large data centers, and we are constantly migrating content into new hardware in new facilities as the costs come down, densities go up, a variety of possibilities induce us to make those changes. And we're happy to do that, and we're doing that, in a sense, on behalf of all the people whose data we happen to hold in our cloud. Now, usually it doesn't work to go to the senior people in the company and say, by the way, if Google ever stops, if we ever go away, we should be worried about that. And of course, their reaction is, we're never going away, or I'd be worried about that too. We don't want it to go away, but what if it did? So my concern is we want to be able to preserve this content beyond the lifetime of many companies. So we're talking about hundreds of years. There aren't very many institutions that have that kind of longevity. I can think of a few. Breweries, for example, wineries, which have lasted hundreds of years, the Catholic Church, which actually had a lot to do with preservation of materials during the Middle Ages, where monks were copying things on vellum. Other institutions, though, that have amazing longevity, universities, for example, some of them over 1,000 years old, and other educational institutions. Libraries also have had a history of longevity, although there are a few that didn't do too well, like the Library of Alexandria, which burned down twice, as I recall. There's a third version of the Library of Alexandria, by the way. Ismail Serageldin is the former founder and director of that third version in Alexandria, Egypt. And I mention this to you partly because it is a magnificent $50 million building. It's a cylinder which has been cut off at an angle and views out into the Mediterranean. But it also happens to be the backup for the Internet Archive that Brewster Kahle runs out in San Francisco. And I think there's another one in Japan somewhere. So what's important here is that we need the solution to preserving digital content is going to have to involve long-lived organizations and institutions. It's also going to require some standards, and the reason for that, it should be obvious. Of course, there's the question of metadata and making sure that we know exactly what bits do we have, where did they come from, how are they to be used, what is their format, and so on. But there's also this very important question of how we could have multiple places preserving information, and even if some of them were to end their ability, we'd want standards to allow transfer to others who could continue to carry that information forward into the future. So standards are going to be a really key part of making digital preservation long-lived. So let me mention a few of the other challenges that I see in the preservation game. One of them has to do with intellectual property rights. So if you think for just a moment about how you create digital information today of your own, you have mobiles that take pictures, 1.7 trillion of them in 2017, according to some data. There are documents and presentations and spreadsheets and other sorts of things which you use application software to create and to read and to interact with. Well, often that software is not open source. Open source could be our friend here in the sense that it may have longevity beyond any particular patent claim or even copyright claim. But there are pieces of software that have intellectual property rights associated with them. And so if the organization chooses not to support that anymore, which may have good business reasons for such a decision, then we may be out of luck because that particular version of software may be the one that we need for the documents that we've created or the digital objects that we've created. When we might say, well, can we have the source code for that in order to find a way to maintain the utility of our digital work? And the answer might be no, that's our property, we're not giving it away. Can we have the object code version of it? Well, no, because we're protecting that. Well, could the library, acting as digital preservation agent, have access to this object code or even source code? And could it allow third parties to get access to that for purposes of accessing preserved digital content? The answer might be no, unless we create a legal regime in which digital preservation rights are incorporated, instantiated, or enshrined, so that certain institutions have the right to get access to certain kinds of software for purposes of preservation. So we're faced with a possible intellectual property challenge in the case of maintaining this stuff. And think for a minute, you have an application that runs on an operating system that runs on a piece of hardware, and all three of those things have to work in order for your particular digital content to be useful. Some people, including me, observe that in the cloud world, it might be possible to emulate old hardware and run old operating systems and run old applications. And indeed, we have examples of that happening at Carnegie Mellon, for example. Mahadev Satyanarayanan We call him Satya because we can't pronounce his name for more than once or twice. Satya has developed a particular mechanism for emulating old hardware on which he has been able to demonstrate the operation of old operating systems and applications. So that might be a kind of avenue that takes us further into the future. There's also another big issue here. Let's imagine we're talking about 100 years or 500 years. What is the business model that will allow the preservation of the digital content for such a long period of time? Even if we have the technology to do it, that is not going to be free of charge. So what is the method by which we sustain this? There's a company in the UK which has just launched its pilot called eMortal, which is intended to allow you to preserve your family photos and other family documents, and it's tied to an insurance policy. So think about life insurance. They should call it death insurance because that's what it is, but nobody would buy it, so they call it life insurance. So life insurance policies are intended to provide for your heirs some assets. Well, suppose you wanted to provide your digital assets to your heirs. Imagine a digital preservation insurance policy which goes along with the life insurance policy. Now, some of you will know that many life insurance policies have the property that you keep paying for them until you die. I mean, there aren't very many products that have that property. This is really quite an unusual sales deal. But you can imagine for a reasonable fee, again, we're back to what's reasonable, what is sustainable, what is affordable. But for a reasonable fee, you might be able to endow a policy that will effectively preserve your digital content by paying for the cost of doing that at some institution which has been organized around that. So those are the kinds of things that are echoing through my head. They were themes that we talked about in the previous meeting in Washington, D.C. There are lots of other things that you probably have already thought of that I didn't mention. And so I think what we might most usefully do is to go on to hear what the other ideas are from our two respondents. And then I'd like to propose that we just have a discussion about your reaction, your thinking, and your ideas to assure that this digital content isn't lost. Because I really am quite worried about the 22nd century, not knowing anything about the 21st century because our email, our tweets, our blogs, and all these other things, web pages have all evaporated. And I know there are some people saying that would be a good thing because most of it wasn't worth keeping. But I can tell you from having this experience with a room full of librarians, when some young person stood up and said, this isn't a problem. I mean, the important stuff people will copy and retain and everything else, and the unimportant stuff will be lost and nobody will care. It took half an hour to get the librarians off the ceiling. And the reason was really quite palpable. Sometimes you don't know how important a particular object or document was until 100 or 200 years later, when that particular letter or that particular email or that particular tweet had some major bearing on history, but we couldn't tell when we were so close to it. Let me close with one other observation about a book which I have found extremely interesting to read. It was called A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And this was about Abraham Lincoln essentially hiring all of his opponents to be in his cabinet. And what was interesting about the book is that it's written in a sort of, not quite first person, but it's fly on the wall, rendering the dialogue among the principals. Now think about this. She's writing this book in the 20th century. She's writing about events which took place in the 19th century. And it feels and sounds like she was there. And so you ask, well, maybe she just made it all up. Well, actually, she didn't. She went to libraries around the country that had the letters of the principals in that novel, so she could see what they were talking about, what positions they took, how they spoke about these issues, and she regenerated plausible dialogue on the topics that were at hand, including, of course, the Civil War. I'm trying to imagine what a 22nd century Doris Kearns Goodwin would do to explain the situation in the 21st century. particularly the one that we find ourselves in right now, which I won't elaborate on because this is supposed to be an apolitical meeting. But you know, there are tweets that come to mind, and I would like the 22nd century to understand the, shall I say, dilemma we find ourselves in our 21st century. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention and ask that our two respondents choose which of the two will respond first. Thank you. Okay, you're mic'd up, so you're ready to roll. Afterwards, we got microphones for your interaction. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, but you don't make any sense. No, go ahead.
Then I'm good.
There, you're done.
I'd like to thank Google for hosting us here today. I'd like to thank the Internet Society of New York, and of course, it's an honor to be on the stage with you, Vint. Thank you for asking us to be here to speak on behalf of conversations around digital preservation. So I work at Columbia University, and I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the perspectives coming from Columbia University and the libraries. Columbia University has a mission, as many institutions are wont to have. It is to both advance knowledge and learning at the highest level and to convey the products of its efforts to the world. And within the libraries, we support that mission in acquiring, in the past, making available information to support research and learning, and of course helping our faculty and our students create and produce material to disseminate that in support of research, teaching and learning, whether it's faculty-produced books and publications, student dissertations, and other research activities. The libraries itself and the university supported mainly by three types of funding. One, of course, is tuition. Thank you for all of you who send students to Columbia. I appreciate that. And faculty research grants that come from the government and major foundations supporting our faculty research activities. And of course, we have endowment funding. Endowment, thanks to many benefactors and generous donors of the past who helped build up a sizable endowment that supports operations and innovation. And the library itself, we get grants and donations, both in terms of in-kind collections that we collect, but also money that helps us process those collections and create services and allow us to do some level of innovation. Even before the digital era, a single library couldn't acquire and preserve everything in print. So the concept that any one institution or any one entity can preserve all that is preservable or all that is knowable has been a challenge, right, since Alexandria's libraries burned down. And so within the modern era of libraries, we've worked together to share our print materials at scale. Things like interlibrary loan and book lending programs and other types of methods that would share our resources among hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions around the United States and around the world. And in terms of preservation, one of the mechanisms that evolved was distributed preservation. So lots of copies we would place into various locations and commitments to collect various materials. And sometimes those were coordinated. Many times they were just ad hoc. But the net effect was to collect materials that were perhaps not as popular or mainstream and ensure that if any one library lost it, another library would have it. And this was something that worked for a given period of time during the print era. I'll note that preservation is not just holding the information. There's a dual aspect to preservation. When you preserve something, you also expect to use it at some point. So preservation is not just backup. Preservation includes access. Yes. So we talk about preservation and access as kind of two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them. And the libraries work together over a period of time to establish policies, mechanisms, build up staff expertise, and funding sources to support the long-term preservation and access of these print materials. One big example of that that we've had, in fact, I have a colleague here from New York Public Library. Denise is here. Where's Denise? Oh, hi, Denise. Columbia University and New York Public Library and Princeton University collaborated to build an off-site facility called ReCap, which is a joint effort to build and operate a very large off-site storage facility that houses, preserves, and makes available print, tapes, film, microfilm, and archival materials in environmentally appropriate conditions for the books and for the film. And so this is a success story of collaboration at scale, where even institutions as big as the New York Public Library and Columbia and Princeton saw fit to collaborate together. And in fact, most recently, Harvard University is participating in that as well and is looking to collaborate with us as well. So when institutions very, very large choose to collaborate, we see potentially a model that might also apply for digital preservation. So it continues to be a collective challenge to acquire, describe, and deliver print materials. And our librarians and archivists make decisions on a daily basis on what we decide to collect and what to preserve. And there's a lot of nuance to that. Sometimes we're guided by our faculty, but oftentimes we're guided by the expertise of people who spend sometimes decades in that area or discipline to collect materials that they think will be appropriate for future scholars and future students to use. So now when we turn to digital, we know we can't preserve all that is digital. And we think about how do we design systems that might support preservation. Designing for preservation is hard, right? I mean, how do you design a system to preserve something at the outset when you're working to build a service? And as was mentioned, Google is not thinking about how they're going to preserve what they're building for another 1,000 years. They're thinking about how do they make a profit, how do they build something for the next quarter, next year, maybe for the next 10 years. So there's a challenge in moving from service and delivery to preservation and access. So instead, we may have to consider factors in design that are related really to designing for migration and designing for an exit strategy that foster the long-term management of digital information, just like print, but to ensure that preservation and access at the time of need. So here are 3 ideas to consider that are kind of underpinnings for digital preservation. And when we think about sustainable digital preservation and models, we have to factor in, I think, these 3 ideas. And as Vint mentioned, open is important. We need an open approach because open supports sustainability, open supports this migration concept, and open supports collaboration. And I've discussed 5 opens in the past, and I'll mention these 5 opens. One is we need open communities of practice to provide sustainable expertise over time. The expertise has to be known and shared within the community, and that knowledge has to be transferred among many, many institutions distributed at a worldwide basis. The second is open formats, because open formats facilitates use, current use, and future migration. We need open protocols, and of course I'm here talking about protocols on stage with you, but open protocols to provide access and meet rising user expectations. Because we are not going to just have user to system, we're going to have user to user and system to system. Protocols will facilitate that type of use. We need open source to support broad use, maintenance, and system migration. And finally, we need open content, open enough to legally allow for replication, conversion, and migration. So number 2, we need expertise. We need new and revised jobs in society to sustain digital preservation over time. In libraries and archives and museums, we've begun to define these roles, and they're actually just coming up, and we're defining them right this month, today, actually. One of our archive directors speaks about every single archivist is essentially a digital archivist. There's not going to be a print archivist and a digital archivist in the future. They will just be archivists, and they will have the expertise to deal with materials as it comes. In fact, the term we use is born digital, materials coming to us that are already digital, or materials that come to us delivered digital, that we acquire, and at the time of acquisition, we convert them to digital, and we get both the print and the digital at the time of acquisition. We have these digital preservation librarians who we're hiring to process born digital and acquired digital materials using some of the tools that were just mentioned. Yes, we have the 3.5-inch floppies and the 5.25-inch. We don't have any 8-inch wangs. But there are folks out there who have some of these resources, and we can process these things and bring them in. We need, in terms of information technology professionals, storage engineers like we see in the industry, but we also need research data experts and other types of IT-related experts who understand digital preservation. And in the libraries, we're looking at hiring new types of librarians, emerging technology coordinators who are tracking the trends for upcoming technologies that might lead to building new types of collections and then manage those collections and ultimately preserve those collections. And finally, number 3, we need institutional models. We need new models to support sustainable digital preservation at scale. When possible, we may be able to leverage the products of industry, such as cloud services, but there may be digital preservation services that may be more appropriately managed by the nonprofit and government sectors. Let me give you a few examples. DuraSpace is an organization, nonprofit, committed to supporting sustainable community-based open source software, like the Fedora software repository software, not the Linux derivative, and DSpace repository software. The Academic Preservation Trust is a consortial effort led by the University of Virginia, and of which Columbia is a member, to build sustainable digital preservation services using commercial cloud back-end services. So an overlay on the commercial cloud with a layer that supports preservation requirements. The Digital Preservation Network, which is bringing together digital preservation nodes across the country to manage long-term preservation with a goal of developing an endowment model, ultimately, to sustain preservation efforts over time. And already they have a one-time payment model where smaller institutions can pay a one-time payment model into the Digital Preservation Network, and that material will be sustained in perpetuity. And for larger models, they're working with institutions around the country to build these digital preservation nodes who are then supporting storage and managing that and then collaborating it and sharing it so that it's replicated between institutions. To sustain any one failure, you have a backup in multiple locations. I'll mention HathiTrust, which is storing many of the books that were actually digitized through the Google Books initiative, and we have to thank Google for their leadership in the Google Books digitization effort. The libraries came together, and there's over 100 libraries funding a HathiTrust, Hathi elephant is the term there, to store our books that are now over 14 million books made available nationally and internationally through the HathiTrust. And I'll mention Portico because Kate Wittenberg is here from Portico. Hi, Kate. How are you? We maybe want to ask a few questions to Kate later. We talked about how will we escrow our materials. And in fact, we've worked with publishers already. The libraries and publishers working with Portico have escrowed things like e-journals and e-books. In fact, there's over 500,000 items stored in that archive today, and we cooperatively pay to store that like an insurance policy. Those e-journals and e-books are escrowed, and should one of those journals or publishers go out of business, Portico can light the data back up so that the libraries can retain that data. And we can maybe talk to Kate a little bit later on that. So it's always great to have someone who's doing it at scale right here in the room. So why does this all matter? I think we kind of know why it all matters, but let me just give you two examples from Columbia's perspective. Columbia University needs sustainable digital preservation in order to capture and preserve the results of scientific research and exploration, to foster scientific reproducibility, and to support future scholarship and teaching. We have researchers like Professor Robin Bell and her colleagues at our Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. They literally fly down to Antarctica and they fly over Greenland. And what they are trying to do are understand changes to the polar ice sheets and the glaciers. With NSF funding, National Science Foundation funding, our taxpayer dollars, they've attached ice-pod sensors, these 8-foot-long sensors, on the bottom of an LC-130 cargo plane that's flown by the New York National Guard over Antarctica and over Greenland to collect data on the glaciers and ice sheets to the tune of about 100 terabytes a year. And you need to collect that data every year. You need to know the longitudinal data in order to study the effects, for example, of climate change on glaciers. A second example, our new Zuckerman Institute laboratories are now staffed with over 600 researchers, brand new building, exploring how the brain develops, how it performs, how it endures, and how it recovers from disease or injury. It's led by Nobel laureates Richard Axel and Eric Kandel, and they expect to generate petabytes of data over the next several years. The institute itself is endowed with a $200 million gift from Mortimer B. Zuckerman, and it's housed in the Jerome L. Green Science Center, built with a $200 million gift from the Jerome L. Green Foundation. So incredible donations by individuals to support this scientific research and discovery effort. Investigating the effects of climate change, increasing our understanding of the human brain, these are just two examples among thousands of research activities going on at institutions like Columbia at any given time. And these efforts must be captured, preserved, and made accessible for the future. So finally, on a personal note, as a kid, I got my library card at a Carnegie library up in Yonkers, New York. Essentially Carnegie, thanks to the steel industry. That's how I got my library card, right? Partially. And now I work in Butler Library at Columbia University, originally built with funding from Edward Harkness, an oil executive. And here we are at Google. It may be that sustainable long-term digital preservation will only be possible with strong collaboration and funding. And that comes from a strong public, private, nonprofit partnership. We may need a new generation of benefactors to help create a vision and fund the digital library infrastructure and services and these endowments needed to sustain digital preservation to serve the public good. So thank you.
No, next up. Hey, no, you're supposed to stay up here. You get, this is the target area. I'm not going to be the only target in this discussion.
No. So one of these people is not like the other. I am not a librarian. I am not a specialist in preservation. I'm a venture capitalist, and I'm about to roll off the stage. I work with a venture capital firm here in New York called Union Square Ventures, and I think I was asked here to talk a little bit about business models. And I think what we will conclude as we get into the conversation is that there probably is not a single business model that can support this, the preservation of all of this content. But what I would like to do is just sort of challenge some of the embedded assumptions in the conversation that we've had so far. And I think that deeply embedded in the way we've been talking about this is the assumption that data is going to be stored in a central place and retrieved from that place, and it's going to have costs associated with that, and there's going to need to be some way of supporting that. And I think it's actually kind of interesting to, that we're having this conversation. I love the notion that libraries are already collaborating in a distributed way, making sure that data is replicated in multiple places. Because I think there's a real possibility that the future is going to start to look like that. And what's ironic about it is that when I was at AT&T back in the 80s, and we were just beginning to see the first glimpses of the commercial internet, every network engineer at AT&T thought that this was ridiculous. It was a toy. It was not deterministic. You couldn't prove that a packet would get from one side to the other. And it depended on all these people that you'd never met. And they'd much rather have a much more centralized system. And then we had this magic thing happen where people chose to contribute to this resource and participate in this network, and all the properties that we now understand came out of that very radical distribution of the functionality. So how might that happen here? Well, we've heard about some of the ways in which we're going to accumulate a lot more data. But we haven't heard specifically about the Internet of Things and about the degree to which we're going to start to accumulate data as individuals about everything from our running habits to our sleeping habits to our conversations with our spouse being recorded by one or another digital assistant. But we are going to be collecting an enormous amount of data. And so the question I'm grappling with is there a possibility that individuals will actually have an interest in preserving that data and in making some of that data available in some way to a collective? And one of the things that sort of triggered this thought in my mind was talking with a group that is working really hard on trying to clean up the internet and specifically social media. Very frustrated with the degree to which the conversation has been demeaned in social media, and trying to think about why that's happened and how to kind of bring it back to a higher level. And the one thing they told me is that in trying to identify a troll, someone who is actually demeaning the conversation in social media, the single biggest indicator is the length of time that account has existed. So new accounts are automatically suspect, and you can think about why, right? So if an individual has been accumulating experience, accumulating data as they interact with multiple services, that is a really good data set for proving that you should have the privilege to engage in a certain way. So I think basically your accumulated stream of data may at some point be seen as your reputation. And if your reputation allows you to get on an airplane or participate in a conversation or have some privileges, then you're going to have an incentive in storing that. Now, the tricky part about that is you're going to have to store it in a way that's provably not manipulated, because obviously the bots are really good at that, and so you're going to have to prove it in a way that's not manipulated. And there you're going to get into something that involves something like a blockchain, some way of proving without a central authority that data was administered, or data was stored at a particular time and it was correct when it was stored. And so there's another sort of dramatic example of that. We work with a company that's actually creating a contest for AI researchers and data scientists to predict markets and allowing them to work on a common data set. And one of the things that Richard Crabe, the guy who founded that, mentioned to me one time is that with a blockchain, it ought to be possible for anybody anywhere to build a track record proving that they can anticipate markets, because they don't actually have to have capital. All they have to do is make the predictions and then prove that the predictions were correct and then show what that synthetic track record would look like. And so the ability to store your data provably in a way that's not modified might create an incentive for individuals to create that data. So further, so that's the radical decentralization of this data. It means that we're not collecting it in a curated way, but we're actually collecting it in a very widely decentralized way. There are a couple of technologies that are working in this area. The interplanetary file system created by a guy named Juan Benet, who is formerly a Google engineer, is now running a company called Protocol Labs. Is working on a file system that is based on content addressing instead of location addressing. So this addresses some of the concerns that we have about broken URLs. His next project is something called Filecoin, which is a radically decentralized storage system that allows anybody with extra storage to participate in a network that stores files for anybody else, and it creates an incentive layer with a cryptocurrency called Filecoin. We should keep an eye on that. That's I guess the one thing I wanted to throw into the conversation is the possibility that if we look at storing data differently, if we stop thinking about it as a set of institutions are accumulating data and looking for a way to extract value out of that data and need to get paid for that value and need to incur all the costs associated with that storage, and we start thinking about it as everybody has an interest in accumulating their own data and having an interest in that data and having the ability to make that data available either in a collective for whatever social research purposes or as reputation. Do we end up thinking slightly differently about how we need to preserve it? So that's...
Wow. Okay, that's a very interesting this is what I propose to do. I propose to rebut some of this stuff, or at least draw attention to some of the some considerations that ought to be taken into account. First of all, the role of government. I think we have a very deep dependence right now on at least the National Archives here in the United States, and I have great sympathy for them because what they often receive is a disk drive from the previous administration, not the laptop, just the disk drive. Thank you very much. Well, how is this stuff encoded? What's on it? Which versions? It's a nightmare. But government has a role to play in the National Archives. It also has a role to play in terms of supporting research that might get us farther along in technical capabilities to do preservation. So I think the government does have an important role. I wanted to draw attention to something that didn't get mentioned in any of our remarks. Think about a collection of content. Let's even imagine it's your content, which you decided you wanted to preserve for the future. And as you give thought to this, you think about, well, who should have access to this content? Do you want this to be publicly accessible? And even if you want it to be publicly accessible, when do you want it to be publicly accessible? Like maybe only after you've been dead for 25 years, so that your family won't be embarrassed by what you left behind. Or do you want to be able to say these people should have access to this data, and those people to that data over with certain periods of time? So the access control gets really interesting. The part which is the most weird is how do you identify the parties that are supposed to have that access control? I mean, they don't all necessarily have Google accounts. Well, they should, but they probably don't. So, what is the right means to identify them? Of course, people have duplicate names and all this other stuff. I'm not sure. How do you even refer to people who haven't been born yet? So I'm not sure how you would create a regime for identifying who should have access and under what circumstances. And I think that may be a problem we have to figure out how to solve. So this notion of identity turns out to be important. I have been thinking about something kind of like this last, sort of distributed consumer-like response to the problem. I'm thinking, well, a lot of my stuff is sitting today it's in the Google Cloud. Tomorrow it might be spread across multiple clouds, but I still feel this uneasiness about my stuff out there in the cloud somewhere. What if I had a memory box that all the stuff that's in the cloud that belongs to me is also in my memory box, and my memory box gets updated by a company that makes the memory box over time, so it gets new hardware, things get copied, standardized access controls and things like that. So maybe that you could imagine a product with service behind it that would allow individuals to feel that as if they had at least preserved their data, even if it was out in the cloud, in case anything happened, they'd still have their memory box. And maybe the memory box doesn't even stay in their homes. Maybe it stays in the bank, like the bank deposit boxes, which are there partly to protect against fire and other kinds of disasters. So that's a little thought. I can't read my own handwriting, and I have to admit that I can't. All right. So, yes. Now, this is a very important rebuttal of something you said about the Internet. You were almost right, but I think in the context of what we're talking about, it's not a good model. When the Internet was built, Bob and I were saying, look, folks, if you could build things that meet this set of standards, and if you could find somebody to connect to, then they should interwork. That was sort of basically the bottom line. But the parties that chose to act on that were not individual consumers. They were companies that wanted to get into the Internet service business. And so we can't quite use the Internet as the model to say individuals would choose to support this stuff, because in the end it was really organizations that did. So that's the only nit that I would put on there. I don't know if you want to react to that, but would you like to defend yourself, sir?
In talking about the Internet with you?
No. But I think the distinction is worth making. And so then the question is, do you see that it might be possible, not necessarily for individuals, but for institutions, to see a preservation business as something that people would pay for, in the same sense that others saw that Internet service was something that people would pay for?
Could I ask?
Yeah.
Can I ask all of you a question? How many of you have a safe deposit box at a bank? How many of you have it? It looks like less than.
This
looks
really
like a third. Does it look a third? Okay. For those of you now, right? There was a good question. You can't get one because it isn't available in your town. They're full, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So those of you who have a safe deposit box, how many of you have digital storage in your safe deposit box of any kind?
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay.
I haven't done that.
How many times do you go to the safe deposit box to put the data in? Does anyone want to answer? How often do you swap it in? Every few months? Okay. How many terabytes do you have in your safe deposit box? Three
terabytes over there.
So
what am I bid for?
So just a question. No, the reason why I ask is because the memory box concept is quite interesting. So I have about 12 petabytes in my safe deposit box. It cost me all of $250 for 3 hard disks, and I put the pictures because I don't print any of my photographs, and my wife is really mad because I've got everything in digital and she wants everything in print, and of course it's impossible. It's a generational thing, right? So every single print, every single photograph, and every single video, and all of the things that are important for family, I have in a safe deposit box.
Okay.
The less important things. But it's interesting to see, more importantly, that only a third of you have a safe deposit box for paper. And so that's an interesting question about the value of preservation in today's society now so maybe the question is, for those of you who don't have a safe deposit box, do you feel you're preserving your print materials or other materials, financial materials, in a safe way through some other mechanism?
That's an interesting question because there are a lot.
So there's a raise in hand. Yeah. So a few people do. So it's quite interesting, right? I mean, I think we have a preservation problem that's not just digital.
So I want to bring up the other side of this equation. I spent the afternoon in a wonderful condo over lunch with a man who has collected tens of millions of dollars of publication books and manuscripts from the 15th and 16th century. And these things were still absolutely beautifully readable. They were illuminated and everything else. Of course, if you didn't read Latin, that's a little problem. But the point I want to make is that we have proof that that particular medium can be made to last for a very long time. And so what I worry about those petabytes you have in the safe deposit box is whether the physical medium and the little plug that you have to plug into it will have any place to go when you take it out again 10 years from now, unless you are upgrading into new formats and new digital, and it gets harder and harder to do that over time because petabytes is a lot. The movie industry has this problem. They have gone from celluloid to digital, and the problem they've run into is the digital keeps getting higher and higher resolution. And so they've ended up, the formats have changed. Every couple of years they have an upgrade, and the guys that standardize the formats for digital film, so to speak, have promised backward compatibility only for a couple of generations, like 2 generations. So the movie industry has been copying a lot of its digitized older film plus all the born digital stuff. Every couple of years they have to upgrade everything, the hardware and the software and everything else, and it's expensive.
Is it really that expensive? That's the question I do not have an answer to.
They're spending tens of millions of dollars a year trying to maintain their archives.
So, but the specific question of the cost of, I'm thinking of it in the way people think of Shinto temples, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They've been in, there are temples that have been around for 1,200 years, but they're rebuilt every 20 years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're rebuilt every 20 years, and so they're perfect.
Okay,
they're perfect replicas of what existed 1,200 years ago, and I'm wondering if when we move to the cloud and CPU is relatively affordable for my personal data stream, is it really that expensive for me to?
Well, the aggregates
rebuild it every 20 years.
Looking at the cloud people, the answer is. It's clearly affordable because they wouldn't change if it weren't. And so we spend huge amounts of money upgrading because it's effective. It's cost effective to do that. But I'm not as clear whether that's true for an individual consumer because sometimes we're talking about bulk buys, we're talking about volume discounts and things like that. So I don't know the answer to that. It's an interesting question. Can I just quickly pick up 1 or 2 other nits to get them out of the way here? Okay, you mentioned the interplanetary file system, which is a blockchain implementation, as near as I can
Actually,
recall.
Filecoin, Filecoin is the blockchain implementation. The interplanetary file system is a protocol that introduces content addressing instead of location addressing, and it's independent of Filecoin, which sits on top of it.
I thought that he also included some mechanism which was intended to inhibit modification of the records that were stored, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
There is yes, because in order to use content addressing, you have to have a hash of the content. And
okay, so it's a hash-based function, not necessarily a specific blockchain. Thank you. That's a good clarification. But last thing I wanted to mention that came to mind while you were both talking is something about the World Wide Web as it presently exists. It is very deeply dependent on domain names. And Is that me or somebody else? That's somebody else. I'm turned off. Okay, so domain names have this unfortunate property that they are not persistent over time. If you fail to pay your rent, the domain name may go away or someone else will acquire it, and a resolution either fails or the resolution succeeds, but it ends up in a place that the original owner of the domain name didn't intend. So we need to have some kind of identification system, whether it's the content addressable interplanetary file system or some other, like maybe Bob Kahn's digital object identifier world, in order to have long-term identification. The thing that worries me a great deal related to this topic tonight are the print publications that have URLs in them. And the writers of those documents intended that the references resolve in order to illuminate the, no pun intended, manuscript of the writer. And that may fail significantly as time goes on. And so we've already somehow infected our academic and other publications with a fragility that was not intended. And I think that's really a serious problem that we need to deal with. So what would you like to do? We can have an argument up here, but it looked to me like we had a bunch of hands going up already in response to questions. So shall we find out whether any of you sitting here tonight have ideas you'd like to put on the table? There are microphones at both sides of the room. I see hands are already up. Do you want to come to the microphone, or should we, let's see. Do these work? Test, test.
Yes.
Well, go ahead. All right.
I'm a press student here, and I study user experience design. I was thinking that maybe we could, like filing text, you do that yearly, right? So if you want it, we can start with legislation, and we regulate that everyone should file their memory to the government, and if government cannot to do this kind of stuff, they can outsource to data centers.
Interesting.
So
Wow.
I can
Yeah,
just,
go ahead.
So it turns out that a number of federally funded research has been deposited in government databases. Those databases are sometimes built and funded to support scientific data. And the government itself runs many databases. The challenge is governments, like any other institution, have budgets that can go up and go down.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
I would like to. I think that like if we file these things have value. So maybe the data center should pay licensing fees to people who file this data.
But some of the government, some of the data that we generate has no monetary value. It has intrinsic value. Like if you take satellite data, for example, observational data of the Earth, it has intrinsic value, but perhaps no monetary value. Those glaciers, for example, that we're collecting petabytes of data on, or brain genomic data, or information about the brain. The raw data, you might not have any monetary value attached to it. In fact, the whole point is to share it broadly and widely for scientific research. It turns out the government, the United States government and other governments, sometimes don't keep the data over long periods of time. And it turns out that the older data that was actually referenced in those citations, in those earlier scientific articles, might not actually be there anymore. And so centralizing the storage is one way to do it, but it has risks if that entity, in fact, starts to drop off data on the backside. And it's already happened within the last 50 years. So I think if we look at 100 or 150 or 200 years, I think there's ample concern that a single entity storing it might not be enough, and we have to have distributed models.
Okay, we have queues of people at both of these microphones, and other hands are going up. So I'm going to try to cycle around a bit. Let me take this microphone over here, and then we'll ping-pong back and forth, and you'll be number 3.
Thanks. I'm Joe Plotkin with the Internet Society of New York. Thanks, Vint, and everybody for a great discussion. It's really important stuff. I'm sort of interested on the messy side, which is sort of what Vint was alluding to. The next Doris Kearns Goodwin goes into an attic and finds a box of floppy disks or zip disks like I have, or my hard drive, and I'm deceased, and there is no legacy because nobody wrote it, nobody knew they were going to get into a car accident or the plane was going to crash, and now you've got You've got encryption that's got to be unencrypted. You've got formats that don't exist. You've got physical objects that don't exist. You know, VMware can only do so much. So what will the Doris Kearns Goodwin now, if she came across a box of 1975 floppy disks, do, and how would that play out 50 years, 100 years from now?
She'd be faced with the same thing some of us have already encountered, which is our stuff from the 1980s anyway, may or may not be recoverable and retrievable because we didn't think about it at the time and we didn't plan ahead. And, you know, I admit to you that in my case, it didn't occur to me for whatever reason that this stuff wasn't going to work anymore. And so I would just pile up the disks because I could keep putting them in, and then one day the machine died. By the way, homework assignment. There is a very short story written by E.M. Forster called The Machine Stops. It was written in 1909, and it's all about a society that depends on machines to feed them for interaction. They stay at their homes. They never see each other face to face. It's a whole society wrapped up around that technology, and then one day the machine stops working, and it's homework to go find out what happens. Okay, this is number 3.
Can I pick up on that for a second?
Oh, yeah,
I think the thing that isn't being answered is the question about encryption and passwords. And, you know, I get hit by a bus. And so you asked the question, how many people have a safety deposit box? How many people have a plan for someone, their wife, their husband, whatever, to get access to all their accounts?
Whether, passwords and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
It's not
I
quite
see a few
half of
hands
us.
up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's scary is where do you put that information, and is that a target for, you put it in one place, and how do you make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands?
Yeah, we're already getting boxes with floppy disks, jazz disks, zip disks, SideQuests, and computers in them. So it's already a problem. And actually, the criminal criminal investigation units of our police departments have created forensic workstations, and we've purchased those within libraries to provide conversion. But I think that the issue will be not the media, because frankly, the transition to digital and the era of personal computers is pretty transient compared to what we have right now, which are personal computing devices with no storage at all. So what happens 50 years from now when the Doris Kearns Goodwin sees 3 cell phones in there and the batteries exploded and all the data stored on that device? So I think we do have that risk of the digital dark age with some of these transitional technologies if there's not backup plans to store it.
Wow. You're on.
I have a question that ties in with something that you said and what she previously said. Say I don't want to participate in that collection of data. I have my data, I'm very private. I want my pictures for myself, for no one else. And fast forward 20 years, should I be able to board an airplane without the government knowing more about me than they know already? That means passport. Should I have a profile of some sorts, be mandated to do that, to save that? So what do you see as a way forward in deciding that in the first place? So what do I have to tell you about me in order to function in this society?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard question. I think it's contextual, and based on the privilege that you're asking for. Do I want to be recognized as a member of a community? Do I want to board an airplane? Whatever. And this is the hardest problem. Most people are very focused on privacy, and so when you start to talk about collecting all of your data in one place, and then making it accessible, because perhaps you want to make it accessible to service providers for them to run algorithms on it and provide services to you in a way that you have some control over. But the trade-off is you have to be willing to exchange data for services. The question is there some interesting way that you could shard that data into very specific buckets and make specific buckets available and only available? I think the hard problem would be if you had to, for each interaction that you have, think about how frustrating it is when you load a new app on a cell phone. You have to go through 18 checkboxes and say, I don't want to do that for every interaction I have with a service provider. So I want some sort of pre-packaged set of defaults that is based on separating GPS data from social media data from something identity data.
This is just so much work. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
imagine people being willing to go through all of that. But there is an access control question. Even if you wanted to control access to your material, let's forget about the government, let's forget about service providers, you still have the problem of trying to identify the parties that you would want to have access. So at Google, we have this problem too, because we have all these people who have accounts. We give them a mechanism that lets them tell us if they have no longer accessed their account for 9 months, what are we supposed to do? Should we assume they're dead? Should we notify somebody that you haven't accessed your account for 9 months? Should we kill the account and wipe all the data? So we try to remind people that there's an opportunity there. He's levitating out of his chair. So
What I wanted to get is there's the aspect of risk management for yourself. You know, you have data there that turns out in 20 years from now the legislation's changed and it's something that you look back on and say, oops, how do I get this out of that? You know,
it's risk management, but it's also velocity. The velocity of change is such that it's becoming increasingly difficult for individuals as well as corporations and institutions to keep up with that change. What I would say is that standalone computing existed for a period of time. You know, there was mainframes and time sharing, and then there was this period of personal computing where everything was standalone.
Right.
And now it's increasingly difficult to find standalone applications that aren't somehow connected to cloud backends.
Yeah.
So I think we are at a period where to be purely off the grid, as it were, with computing, perhaps it will be a sub-industry in the same way that people putting solar panels on the roof is a sub-industry to the power industry, and maybe that'll evolve. But I think it will require enough of a business to support those applications and software environments that would support standalone computing.
it is getting harder and harder. Let's get this question over here, and I'll get you next, David.
I think the right to be forgotten in Europe is pretty good, and
We can't hear you, so
psychological and
you want to just pull that thing down. Guys in the back, have we got this microphone live?
I think the sociological and psychological impact that a black box has or has had for the past couple of 100 years is a good thing. That's not my question, but my question is a two-part question. I don't want to sound like a broken record, or neither does Tim Berners-Lee when he asks about the semantic web. Years and years and years ago, and how does that relate to what we're currently doing? And I know you brought up the Internet of Things, and I know GE Predix is doing an operating system for the Internet of Things, sort of. Can we do that for identity management? Is this a conversation that should be had, and how does it all relate? Please.
So this is very interesting. With regard to not the dark web, but the deep web, which is what
The deep dark web.
I'm sure Tim is sad that there exists a dark web. But anyway, the deep web was an attempt to expose information in the World Wide Web, which was not available in HTML and therefore not indexed by the crawlers, like the ones that we operate in Microsoft and so on. And so his attempt was to try to find a way for that data to become exposed, which I think is a very laudable attempt, because there's a huge amount of data which is not immediately visible when you do a Google search, for example, because of that. I don't see that has succeeded very much. And so the honest answer is that it's turned out to be hard. There's some work going on at an organization called schema.org, which is trying to make available descriptors of content and the identification of various formats. And so that's an attempt to move in the direction of identifying content which is not otherwise crawlable for that. The second question was about, I have a push-down stack that's one level deep these days, and it's really...
So there's a, you guys had brought up the fact that there's the IoT of things.
Oh, right, yes. Now. Should there be an operating system for this? You guys want to have a reaction?
As far as identity and semantic data and...
Well, let me try another take on the first question, which is the challenge that we have is that there is such an advantage to a corporation to create a proprietary format if they can establish that proprietary format as a standard, that they're very reluctant to share that format. And so it'll be very interesting to see if there's some way, as we begin to think about the value in the data to converge some of these formats. But it's also a problem for preservation, because these architectural drawing packages have very proprietary data formats, for a reason.
So, what may happen along these lines, it's not specifically IoT, and it's certainly not necessarily strictly about your personal data. But with regard to standard formats and protocols, the institutions that have chosen to be part of the preservation business, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, may find, in fact, value in having common standards and interoperability for the same reason that the internet did. And so I am sort of optimistic about those standards evolving.
Regarding Internet of Things, I don't think this is a software or hardware issue. I think it's really an issue about a contract with the customer in terms of the longevity and maintenance of it. So with personal computers or phones, there's a contract, right? With a personal computer operating system, maybe it'll be supported 5 years after the last date of manufacture. With a cell phone from a reputable company, it's 3 years. There has to be some contract that is well understood by the customer when they buy it, that device will be maintained, patched, and supported, and have certain security in there for a certain period of time. I think the challenge is these things are moving very, very fast. They're very inexpensive, and they're very attractive to the customers, and customers want them. So I think this may have to shake out for a period of time before we see some resolution that balances the need for low cost and capabilities with some commitment to security, safety, preservation. And I don't think we're there yet, because I think it's just way too new.
I think there's a big issue associated with the information that's accumulated as a result of using these devices, and who has access to that, and what control do we have over it. David's next, and then we'll go over to this microphone.
One question and a couple observations. Suppose a company like Google, just for amusement, goes bankrupt. Okay.
I've already been through that once with another company.
I know. Who owns the data? And historically, there have been several cases where bankruptcy has essentially meant that all the data that company, personal data that company had, was sold in the bankruptcy sale.
As an asset.
As an
treated
asset.
as an asset.
And I don't think our legal regime is in place yet.
Well, there's probably an end-user license agreement that you did a click-through on that would probably tell you right now who owns that data today. You don't have to wait for the institution to go bankrupt to know that information. We tend not to read the 70 pages or 80 pages of it because we don't know how to read it, and we tend to click through because we just want to set up that account. But I guarantee you that every one of those companies that you click through that's a for-profit company has contractually made you say something at click-through. So whether that's enforceable or not, and how it gets aggregated, but when it's actually more common when a company gets bought or sold, typically those assets are transferred. Your information is considered an asset of the company and transferred over to that other company.
So that's a different scenario with different properties, but equally concerning.
Well, because that other company could then change the terms and conditions and be unfavorable to you.
Okay,
It's much more common than a bankruptcy issue around these companies.
And to put it mildly, there's no international law that's consistent there. So we're about to find out with Europe and the U.S. The other one was there is a model for some things that people want to keep track of and perpetuate, and that's cemeteries, where I pay a fee, allegedly, to guarantee perennial care for that grave. Seems to me that's not a bad model. If you could make it economically attractive.
I can just see it, a data coffin. This is. I know what I'm going to, and I know exactly the additional service that I would ask for in order to induce me to do this. What I want it would be a continual email system running, so I could have an eternal flame. Just generating email messages at random, sort of shooting at anybody I happen to not like in the course of my previous life. It's perfect, David. Thank you. That's a new business model. That's right. You want to?
There is an assumption underneath the cemetery model, which is that the individual has a control over their data. They're asking, the individual is, or the family is asking for the preservation of that individual's legacy in that gravestone or whatever. Yeah.
Many states.
Okay. Are you waiting over there? And then we'll get one over here.
Hi, I'm Sveta. I'm deaf, so I'm having someone read my text for me. I find discussions about preserving digital information really interesting. I have a couple of questions. Can artificial intelligence make digital preservation more efficient? There's so much talk about AI lately. Do you see its major role in preservation? Second, There was this episode in the X-Files show recently about storing human memories in digital spaces. What do you think about this? Would that become a reality?
Wow. Okay. Those are great questions.
So the first question, I think I can answer just in one small context, which is metadata and information that's used to describe information. I think there's a great hope here that using artificial intelligence, heuristics, machine learning, we can more efficiently capture descriptive information about born digital information that has no descriptive information. And in doing so, perhaps provide enhanced discoverability over time. Because right now the tradition has been that people touch the record and modify the record. And that's not going to scale when you have trillions and trillions of files. So there is a possibility that we'll be able to leverage increasingly machine learning and other techniques to support metadata creation and help provide discovery services. So I don't know if you want to add about the AI piece.
No, I mean, so AI is going to work against a data set, and I think that yeah, exactly right. The value of it is in the curation and actually, reducing the amount of data that you have to go through by using some intelligent algorithm.
I mean, even in a small scale today, if you have your photos in an application on a computer, you can say, well, that's my mother, that's my sister, that's my brother, and then the system starts to recognize those pictures and attach the metadata to it so that you can search for all the pictures of your mom or your sister or your brother. So we already see that happening in the small, and you don't have to tag it. I think that will continue. The question about capturing neural activity, I think that a lot of effort is going to first start on how we can attach and support functionality that is degraded in humans. And I think in doing so, we're going to learn about the connection between the machine and the brain. So it's already happening with cochlear implants. I think we're seeing it with bionic materials. So I think as that becomes more advanced, we might see it. The question about whether it can capture memory information, I think I'll leave that to a whole other generation of
yeah, this is two comments on this. The first one is that sensory neural understanding of how the brain works is actually quite good. My wife has 2 cochlear implants. She's had them for 20 years. They were life-transforming. The little speech processor that she wears hears for her and sends electrical signals into the cochlea, which stimulates the brain into thinking it's hearing. And it works. So she uses the phone and watches television and so on. That's sensory neural stuff, though. This is not cognitive stuff. And we're very, very far away from even beginning to understand how cognitive memories work or how our cognitive thinking works.
But we have 600 researchers right uptown working on it right now.
If you would like to pursue this idea a little bit, there's a book that I just picked up recently called Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. It's about octopuses, actually, and they are an evolutionary branch of animal which is quite different from ours, but which has a very large brain relative to its body mass. And there are stories telling a lot about the way the octopi react in environments, including doing things that you would think, a rebellious 13-year-old would do. So it's worth looking at that book just to see a different view of thinking. Let's take the next question over at this microphone.
Hi, Sergey Templar. This is Rich. My middle name is Business. No less, I represent fastercapital.com, and we did just raise one startup. That books, no less. None of things is lib.ru, lib.ru, nice, free. The question is, and lovely, yes, I'm HBS graduate, that they joined. Question is, how do you apply blockchains and cybersecurity? Cybersecurity, like to people who use the libraries.
So, blockchains, as far as I'm concerned, have 2 properties. Well, they have several, but one of the properties is that it is supposed to form an immutable record of a transaction. And one does not know, for example, the validity of the transaction itself. A claim, for example, that I own this copyright, I can make the assertion, establish it in the blockchain. The blockchain is now resistant to alteration, but it doesn't necessarily establish the validity of that transaction which was put into the system. So I worry about that. The second thing I worry about is that the item that may have been the subject of the transaction, an ebook, for example, or shares of stock, typically that digital object is not in the blockchain itself. It's referenced by the blockchain, and it's sitting in some other medium. Often that medium is not as protected as the blockchain itself with regard to access. And so we end up with scenarios where the blockchain has correctly recorded that a Bitcoin transaction took place, but the place where the Bitcoins were stored in the wallet was penetrated by a hacker, and the Bitcoins were stolen, which happened at Mt. Gox, and I'm sure there are some other examples as well. So I'm not persuaded right now that blockchain is the magic pixie dust that it is sometimes touted to be. And it has a number of other problems associated with the rate at which transactions can be done, depending on the rate at which you can find the next party to sign the next block. So when you look at transaction rates in the commercial sector today, where we're talking about billions of transactions a day, I continue to be very suspicious of both blockchain and certainly Bitcoin with regard to intrinsic value. So you want to react to that?
I do want to react.
Yeah, because you're investing in blockchain, right?
So that, yeah, I suppose I have to do the disclosure about I am investing in blockchain, but I think the most interesting thing is that there is a possibility that blockchains will turn out to be the native business model for open protocols. And the reason that's important, if you think about the protocols that you created, I mean, I remember I was actually an investor back in the day when there were people selling TCP/IP stacks. And
yeah, you invested in FTP software.
that business was not a good business.
No, Microsoft ran over them when they incorporated the operating system in the Microsoft. So I'm sorry, the protocols in the Microsoft operating.
An open protocol is not a good place for a is for a for-profit equity-backed business. So. What is a blockchain? What does the blockchain allow? It allows for the possibility that you can create a system. I'll use Filecoin as an example. Okay. So Filecoin is a distributed storage system. Think BitTorrent with an incentive structure so that if I store your files, instead of just me getting to watch your movies, I actually get paid a little bit of cryptocurrency, a Filecoin. And if you store my files, I pay you a little cryptocurrency. It's a radically distributed system with this incentive structure. So what happens is there's a limited number of these Filecoin tokens, and as more and more people begin to use the system, then there's pressure on the value of the currency, and the currency goes up. And so it doesn't depend on, if you think about the way equity works, equity is an interest in a future stream of earnings. And so what people want, people like me who invest in equity, they want a monopoly that can extract monopoly rents for a long period of time and pay me that stream of earnings. With an open protocol, there's no way to extract monopoly rents. So how in the world are you going to get somebody to invest in that? Well, if you can get somebody to invest in a currency that's going to appreciate as the protocol becomes more popular, then you can subsidize the creation and the maintenance of that protocol with external funds that are coming in. And then everybody who's participating, and one of the things that's really great about it is the possibility that it's the creators and consumers of value that get the benefit of the appreciation as opposed to some third party. So there is at least a possibility. I'm not going to guarantee it.
We shouldn't have this discussion probably, but that sounds to me like a built-in inflation mechanism, which scares the hell out of me. And that's why I've been watching Bitcoin going crazy. This is for another time over a beer. Let's yes. All right. So Paul, you've been waiting quietly. No, go ahead, Paul, and then we'll pick you up over here.
So my name's Paul Toomey. This conversation's my life, and I'm a bit disturbed about it. I have co-founded a business for digital storage, so I'd love to talk to you more about that. But before that, I was in the DNS, but my original life is I was an historian, and I spent a lot of time in archives looking at documents. So I'm trying to think of. I'm trying to challenge the two gentlemen. I've got used to not challenging Vint. I lose that.
Rats.
I want to challenge the other a little bit about both your visions. As an historian, it strikes me, if you look over the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years of human knowledge, the stuff that we know is essentially curated. It's curated two ways. One of them is by elites having access to resources to curate data, knowledge. The second one is sex. The transfer of the masses of people's life experiences mostly been through their DNA. With the possible exceptions of, or not exceptions, but the occasional finding of ostraca or something else where the average person scratches something on a piece of stuff that lasts a long period of time, does not require energy and does not require cost. So first of all, I'm sort of saying to the librarians, just grasp the fact that you are the elite, that you can get other people to pay for it, the elites will keep paying for it, and you're going to curate, and that's just the reality, right? And we need that, there's no way about it. I am challenging you, I'm deeply into Bitcoin too, I think it's really fascinating, well, not Bitcoin, blockchains, but they need electricity, it doesn't last generations. What's the alternative for the man? I mean, the trouble is the electricity stops, it all stops.
So I'll just add that Carnegie was elite, and he funded the public institutions of libraries. It wasn't funded by the government, and spread that to a very broad and wide audience.
That's the United States. Sorry.
Well, I'm in the United States, but we are in the United States right now. I can't speak.
Well, can I just quickly finish? I just want to ask. Yeah. The one thing I want to leave behind is: are there going to be biological methods of retaining data that have a longer life period and less energy requirements? That's the final part of my question.
That's one of those. That's a great question. I think that it is a really important question about how we channel the best and brightest resources that the country can provide to serve the public good. And I think that is a question that is not limited to libraries and not limited to books. It's a question that is the United States is facing and the world is facing it, which is to where do you concentrate wealth and power, and when do you disseminate it to serve the public good? That's a question. That's a culture question, and I think we're part of that. What I would say is that that even the most powerful and most elite will know that in order for them to be served over time, they have to have a workforce, they have to have an educated population, and increasingly the educated population is the consumer of products, right? When 2/3 of the United States economy is driven by a consumer economy, that has to be driven by, they have to work somewhere, they have to derive income from somewhere. So the race to the bottom and concentrating wealth and power and information is not what we're about. In fact, libraries, by and large, are trying to do the exact opposite. We're trying to free up information, open it up, close the digital divide, open up access. That's the mission that we have in the nonprofit sector and the public library sector. So I think that is a challenge, that many of these things may have come originally from these elite areas, but the mission is to serve the broader good. I don't think there's an easy answer around your second question around whether biologics can be used to store information. I think that's
I actually have some answers to that, but I'll hold on to them because we have so many other people who are lined up. I think we'll have to close the queues because it's almost 7:30. But please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Claudine Mukamabano. I'm from Rwanda. I'm so grateful to be in the room with the founder of Internet Society. I founded the organization called Why Do I Exist? WhyDoIExist.org is my website, with a mission to heal and empower Rwandan orphans. So I published the audiobook, The Power of Social Media. I use the power of social media to stand out from the crowd. I have to take a quick thank note for Internet Society chapter of New York to help me to promote my audiobook by doing YouTube video. So my question is, hearing all of you, your conversation, your information you give us today inspired me to create data, sharing the stories of orphans, survivors of genocide orphans, in terms of preventing future genocide and then also promoting peace, because I saw that people don't understand what we go through when we survive the genocide, the trauma, how we build our lives. It's too much, some lost the love of living. So which if we share the stories, those stories of the survivors will help other people to stop war because they will see how horrible it is to go through war. So my question is to investors. What are you looking for when you're investing money? What are you looking for? What I need to provide in order to have your money to create this data, because I will have to need a big team which will support me to help to create this data.
So that's a targeted question.
What do you need to provide in order to stop war, in order to demonstrate an investable thesis around stopping war? I'd have to think about that. I mean, we don't generally. It sounds like what you're trying to build is a media archive of experiences of the people that went through this trauma, and media is a tricky thing to invest in. And I'd actually, I guess the question is, how big of a team do you actually need in order to create this media? And I guess one piece of advice I'd have is try to figure out. Obviously, you've produced some things already today. Try and do it with the leanest possible team, so that you have the most flexibility in terms of your choices of financing. I think at the end of the day, you may be better off with a different kind of financing, not a venture capital financing, but rather financing from a charitable institution of some kind.
So there are a couple of responses. First of all, I want you to try to get in touch with the U.S. Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. They're chartered by the Congress, and they are very, very active in trying to understand how to create and maintain the peace, and especially using digital technology to do that. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. The second thing, I'll give you the answer that Jane Lute, the former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, gave to this question, how do I create a peaceful environment? And she said simply, put the men to work and educate the women.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. Let's get the final ones. We've closed the queue now because we're really running over time.
Okay. So I'm a digital hoarder. I save every photo, every email message, every document draft because I can. So we're talking about the challenge of digital preservation being that the technology becomes obsolete and makes things inaccessible. But is there a flip side to that, which is that we're storing so much data that for future generations, it's difficult to sort through? To identify what we want to keep and what's important?
So I have a suggestion on this one. First of all, we have evidence that printed photos last 150 years or more. And so if you really, really, really want to preserve a photograph, print it on good quality paper. But the second thing that can happen is that if we are able to retain the digital versions, it will help us find the photographs for the reasons that we talked about earlier. So the ability to apply a machine's capacity to manage and organize digital content can be very, very helpful. I know I love online books. On the other hand, I have a big library, and sometimes I'm standing in front of my library thinking, I know that there's a book in there that has this quote, but I can't remember which one. So I go online, find the quote, then I pull the book off the shelf. Works great. Okay, next question. Last question, I guess.
This is quite captivating and dynamic in terms of a presentation. So my question to you as an economist, clearly there's a disincentive in terms of NSA and the changes in our federal insurance laws and pre-existing conditions and our inestimable President Trump's policies. In terms of data privacy, it's a huge concern. I'm the president and founder of Green Corsair Tech Labs, medical, digital health, next generation medical technology. I have an incentive to take my data to Switzerland or any other country because I'm very dedicated to HIPAA and data privacy, which we can't ensure with NSA. So what is the economic perspective in terms of the loss for our economy, in terms of the lack of faith in terms of dealing with our government's invasion of privacy and the threat in terms of if there's access to medical information, these can be classified as pre-existing conditions, and determine future rates that can be astronomical. So as an economist, I'm sure you have quite a bit of acumen.
Well, I'm just a humble programmer, so I don't necessarily have very good answers. But I have thought about this. First of all, we need incentives for people to share medical information, because the more we're able to share, the more deeply we will understand how our bodies work and how they fail and what causes that. And so I think it's important to find ways to inhibit this kind of cherry picking, if you want to use that word. And it's my understanding that part of what the Affordable Care Act intended to do was that everybody be covered and the pre-existing conditions not be an element, and therefore we spread the statistical risk across the entire population. Unfortunately, as you point out, that is just rapidly deteriorating. So I would much prefer a regime in which the data is available, kept private as appropriate. I have to tell you something about privacy, though, with regard to medical data. The former president of Estonia, Toomas Ilves, points out that he is much less concerned about the privacy of his medical data than he is about its integrity. He doesn't want somebody to go in and change his blood type in his medical record, because if he ever has to have a transfusion, then he would be killed because of the wrong blood type. So he said he was personally more worried about integrity than anything else. And there is an important element to that, integrity of medical information that may have an impact on your life is pretty important, quite independent of the question of privacy.
Which relates to data security and the hacking.
Yes,
issues.
exactly.
So it's integrated. Thank you so
So
much.
this is a huge problem. I had a conversation a few years ago with a woman who was in charge of privacy for Health and Human Services, and I kind of stumped her because I told her I wanted to be a data donor. I said, look, I've got a card in my wallet that says you can have all of my organs if I get hit by a truck. I want to be a data donor. Now, I was in a position to say that because I was healthy and I could afford to pay for my own health care. And not everybody is in that position. But we ought to be able to do that. We ought to be able to contribute our data to a collective that will create value. It's not just health data that's the problem. As you point out, the NSA is also a problem. I can imagine I would want to contribute my GPS data to a collective so that if something occurred on a street corner and I could let somebody know that I was on that street corner, I didn't know that it would occurred, but I saw something, I'd be willing to contribute that. But I have a bad habit. I'm a New Yorker. I jaywalk. And if I contributed my GPS data, I would be getting tickets every other day for
That's very funny.
jaywalking. And so there's got to be a way to sort of create a legal regime that says, if you contribute your data, we will not use your data either to discriminate against you in the healthcare system or to prosecute you without telling you, somehow first that we are now going to start doing this. So it's a really interesting
I can see it now. What you need is an open source jaywalk editor. That's it.
It just
I think that's all the time we've got. Would you like to say anything at the end here?
Thank you all so much for coming. This has obviously been a great discussion. We could go on, I'm sure, for hours more. So sign up at internetsociety.org to join our chapter and learn more about future events. And one more time, please give a round of applause to Vint Cerf, Brad Burnham, and Robert Kettle.
That was really good. Thank you. Thank you. Safe journeys home, everybody. And don't jaywalk.